Okay, so this is the last section of the last chapter of this class. It's called Closing the Frontier, Settling in the West. That's from the end of the Civil War, so 1865, until the end of the 19th century, that's the 1890s. So one thing, before the Civil War, the region before the Mississippi River and California was mostly unsettled. Remember, that was called the wilderness. That was beyond the frontier. I've mentioned that before. It was mostly unsettled by the Americans, meaning that people were living there, the Native Americans, but not the Americans. Now, after the Civil War, after 1865, the federal government encouraged Western settlement and encouraged an economic development. It's a bit similar to what happened in the South. That's what I mentioned in the previous section of this chapter. Okay, it's called the New South. With this industrialization process of the South, and it's a bit similar to what would happen in the West. There was a desire to conquer the West and to industrialize the West and to populate the West. So there are several aspects that contributed to the industrialization of the West and to this process of settling the West. And one of these aspects is the mining factor. Now, the first mass migration to the West took place in 1849, and it was a migration of miners to California. And these miners, they were seeking gold, and this mass migration of 1849 gave them their name. Well, their nickname, they were called the 49ers because, well, it took place in 1849. So that was before the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, there was an increase in this migration process, an increase of migration waves to the West. So I'm going to go through several of them, and migrations due to the advance of the mining front, to the development of mining in the West. So here's a map of the places I'm going to talk about in this section. So first, in 1859, 100,000 migrants moved to Pikes Peak in Colorado. That's right in the middle of the map. And they were looking for gold. Okay, yellow's gold. That's why the square is yellow. They were looking for gold, and this mass migration, 100,000 migrants, that was called the Colorado Gold Rush. Okay, it took place in 1859. It was a big migration, and it led to the creation of the Colorado Territory in 1861, since more and more people were pouring in. Also in 1859, silver was discovered in Nevada, more specifically in Gold Hill. Well, it's called Gold Hill because it was supposed to be gold, but in the end it was silver. That's at the very left of your map. That's in gray for gold. Now, miners came to places such as Gold Hill, and this small town grew rapidly. Now, the mining industry in this area had an important impact on the growth of Nevada and on the growth of San Francisco. Okay, San Francisco not that far away. San Francisco is the city by the bay, so you can see it on the map. There's a kind of bay west of Gold Hill. That's San Francisco, so it's basically the same area. Then a bit later, in 1875, a large deposit of gold was found in the Black Hills. That was in Dakota Territory. Now, the problem was that at the time, the Black Hills belonged to the Sioux. The Sioux is a Native American tribe. However, it did not stop the miners from coming. and the Black Hill Gold Rush began. And this gold rush to the Black Hills, okay, once again it's in yellow on the map, in the middle at the top of the map, Black Hill, I put gold and it's in yellow once again. And this gold rush reached its peak in 1876, 1875. Now remember this one, I'm going to mention it again when we can talk about the relations between the Americans and the Native Americans, because like I said, the big problem was that this land belonged to the Sioux tribe. And now the last is Butte. That's at the very top of your map. That's in the Northern Rockies, and copper was discovered. Now, it actually mining copper was much more profitable, economically speaking. I mean, it was much more profitable than gold or silver. This copper rush, as we may call it, started in 1883 in Butte, Montana. And following that, the region was rapidly industrialized. So you can see that on this map, it's happening everywhere. Colorado, Dakota, Montana, Nevada, and even the northern area of California, and finding gold or silver or copper. And that helped the conquest of the West and the industrialization of the West. Now, the only aspect, hang on a second. It's not the only aspect. Now, during the second half of the 19th century, so that's after the Civil War, many people moved west. Millions of Americans, Mexicans, Europeans, even Chinese moved west, hoping to get rich by finding gold or silver, or in some other places, copper. Now, most of them were relatively prosperous. The problem was that to go west, transportation to move west, and to get land in the West, to live in the West, was actually pretty expensive. And only people from the middle class were capable of affording such a sum of money. Yeah, that's what I put. The poor could not really afford to move west. So this mass migration to the west was mostly the middle class, as you needed money to pay for the transportation and to live there. Now, in the Northern Plains, many foreigners came, such as Germans, Scandinavians, Irish people. And this was a new wave of migration in U.S. history. Okay, people from Northern Europe, from Europe more generally, moved west once again as they hoped to find gold or silver and would get rich. Now, the consequences of this was a dramatic improvement on the railway system. The National Rail Network was created to help this conquest of the West. Now, to give you an idea, here are some figures. The number of miles of railroad tracks went from 35,000 in 1865, so that's at the end of the Civil War, to 200,000 miles at the end of the 19th century. So it's a direct consequence of the advance of the mining front. Okay, people moved west to find gold or silver, so they built towns in the area was where gold or silver would be found, and then the national railway network had to be extended to connect these new towns in the west. So that's one aspect of conquering the West. Now, another major aspect is the relation between the Americans and the Native Americans who were actually living in the West before the conquest of the West. And the relations between the Americans and the Native Americans were not actually peaceful. There were wars. And there's actually two main periods of intensive war between the Native Americans and the Americans. So you have what's called the early Indian Wars and the later Indian Wars. Starting first with the early Indian Wars, 1861, 1868. So it's a long and complicated story, and I'm going to make it short right here, giving you the main pieces of information. You had one major war called the Cheyenne-Arapaho War. That's from 1863 to 1865, so right during the Civil War. This war is also known as the Colorado War, as it was fought in Colorado, and it was a direct consequence of the advance of the mining front. Now, the Cheyenne-Arapaho War included an event that's famous. It's actually more famous than the name Cheyenne-Arapaho War. That's the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. Now, the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, the U.S. Army attacked an Indian camp in the Colorado Territory. And although the Indians waved a white flag, meaning truce, the soldiers killed 200 people. Okay, that's one of the main events of this war and of this period. If you have to remember one, remember the Sand Creek Massacre, 1864, in Colorado. Now, there was a series of conflicts in the north with the Sioux tribe, more specifically in northern Montana, and in northern Montana and Dakota. Okay, that's where the Sioux tribe was living. And this conflict with the Sioux lasted until 1865, when the United States Congress decided to establish an Indian Peace Commission. That's in 1867, to put an end to the wars with the Sioux tribe. So in 1867, there was this Indian Peace Commission. A conference was held and a treaty was signed at a place called Medicine Lodge in Kansas. And this became known as the Medicine Lodge Treaty. That's 1867. And this treaty actually worked as it brought peace in the area. And the Native Americans who lived there would be relocated to reservations in the Indian Territory. Okay, we are in the middle of this reservation policy. Once again, it's a long story, but we're going to make it short right here. Now, the United States Congress appointed this commission and signed this treaty and tried to make peace because they wanted to secure the area. and they wanted to secure the area because of the advance of the mining fronts once again, because more and more people were moving west, because finding gold, silver, copper was very profitable. So they needed to be at peace with the Native Americans, and that's why they tried so hard to put up a commission and sign a treaty. And that basically put an end to the early Indian Wars. Okay, this first wave of wars between the Americans and the Native Americans. But that's not quite the end of the story, as wars would start again a few years later. That would be the period of the later Indian Wars. Now, the later Indian Wars began with the Great Sioux War, 1876-1877. Now, remember, I told you that Americans were actually mining gold in the Black Hills. That's on the map on the previous slide. So just check it if you don't remember. And that gold rush in the Black Hills actually reached its peak in 1876-1877. That means more and more people were moving to the Black Hills. And I told you the problem was that the Black Hills actually belonged to a Native American tribe, the Sioux. Now, a war actually broke out between the Sioux and the Americans because Americans were coming to their land to find gold, and the Sioux did not agree. And the Sioux did not agree because the Black Hills were actually a sacred place for them. Okay, it was their territory, but not only was it their territory, but it was a sacred place. So it was not possible for them to allow anybody actually to dig and try and find gold. So the war broke out between the Americans and two famous native chiefs, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Now, after a couple of months of conflict, Lieutenant Colonel Custer, that you probably know, decided to attack the main camp of the Sioux. And there was a battle, and it's actually a very famous battle. You probably heard of it before. That was the Battle of Little Big Horn. That's in 1876, June 25th to 26th, 1876. The Battle of Little Big Horn. Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Custer attacked the Sioux camp. And once again, to give you some numbers, at the Battle of Little Big Horn, there were 2,500 Indians, the Sioux, following Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, against Custer's men. That's 600 American soldiers. Now, at the Battle of Little Big Horn, the Americans lost. Okay, Custer and his men were killed, were annihilated, literally. So it's a famous battle because it's a great victory for the Native Americans and for the Sioux, more specifically. So that's 1876. However, the American army soon regained the offensive, and the Sioux were forced to give up their lands and the gold fields. Okay, so it's one battle. It's famous because the Native Americans won, because the Sioux won. But in the end, the Native Americans lost the war, and the mining industry just kept going. Now, another famous war in this period is the Nez Perce War in 1877. And the story here is a bit similar to what happened in the Black Hills with the Sioux tribe. The Nez Perce refused to surrender their land. It's very similar. The Americans wanted the land to mine, and the natives refused to surrender their land. Their land was along a river called the Solomon River. And a bit like the Sioux in North Dakota, the Nez Perce tribe lost the war, and they were forced to surrender the land, and then they were moved to a reservation. Okay, we're still in this policy of reservation. Now, another major event at the end of the 1880s was the capture of Geronimo. Okay, in 1886, Geronimo was captured. And Geronimo was a Native American chief. He was an Apache chief. He fought the United States for over 15 years. So it was literally the end of a generation of conflict between the Americans and the natives. The fact that this iconic Apache chief Geronimo was captured. But the event that really put an end to the Indian Wars took place a few years later. Now, a little bit of context. In 1880, there was a religion called the Ghost Dance. Okay, the Ghost Dance was a Native American religion. That's the name of the religion. It was called the Ghost Dance. And the thing is, practicing this religion was forbidden. Okay, the Americans actually banned the Ghost Dance. So I put Native American religion, banned by the US. Now, what happened is that the Native Americans defied the order and kept practicing their religion anyway. And a war broke out. Now, this war, and that's the famous event, this war ended in a bloodbath at Wounded Knee. That's on December 29th, 1890, and that's the Wounded Knee Massacre. Now, the Wounded Knee Massacre is basically American soldiers entered into an Indian camp. There's a storm out. They entered into an Indian camp and they killed some 200 men, women, and children. Okay, that's the Wounded Knee Massacre. That's another milestone in American history. So do remember the Wounded Knee Massacre. That's basically the end of the conflict between Americans and Native Americans, and that's really a massacre, as the American army actually entered a camp, a Native American camp, killing men, women, and children. Yeah, one important thing is to really make a difference between a battle and a massacre. A battle is warriors against warriors. A massacre is just killing civilians. Okay, that's the big difference. So that was the end of the the Indian Wars. They're called the Indian Wars. Now let's have a look at the policy, the federal Indian policy following the end of the Indian Wars. Now, through the 19th century, there was the reservation system. meaning that the Native Americans were actually put into reservations. And at the end of the 19th century, the United States decided to introduce individual land ownership to Native Americans. Okay, that was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. But remember the idea. 1887, they introduced individual land ownership. Now, what does this mean? Basically, the land that belonged to Native American tribes was divided and given to each family, okay? Individual land ownership. That means tribes did not own the land, but individuals would own the land. Well, each family would own the land. Now, this have quite a negative impact on traditional Indian culture that revolved around this whole concept of tribe. And it actually, well, the consequence was that traditional Native American tribes would slowly disappear. Okay, it broke up reservation, it broke up communal unity. And one major negative impact was that many Indians actually lost the land they had been given to speculators. They lost their land because they were not used to live with the concept of private ownership of the land. Okay, owning the land individually was not in their culture. They've never owned land individually. It was always to their tribe. So it was something pretty new, and speculators just bought their land, and many Indians actually lost their land, and that's how it broke up the traditional tribal unity between the Native Americans. So conquering the West was about the advance of the mining front, means gold rushes, silver rushes. Then conflict with the Native Americans that were a direct consequence of the advance of the mining front. One third aspect about conquering the West was the presence of cowboys. All right, now, as the West was being taken from the Native Americans, cattle entered the Great Plain and replaced the buffalo. Okay, I put a map right there to give you an idea of where this actually happened. So buffaloes tended to disappear slowly, and they were replaced by cows. Okay, by cattle. Cattle is mostly cows in the area. To give you some numbers, following, I think I wrote that. Following the Civil War, in the 2 decades after the Civil War, CW is the Civil War. I'm sorry. 40,000 cowboys lived in the Great Plains. So in this area that's in red on the map. Now, who were these cowboys? The cowboys were mostly young men. And as a matter of fact, many of them were Mexicans or African Americans or even Indians. And it's worth mentioning because it's another major factor in the development of many Western territories. To give you some examples, it really helped the development of states such as Kansas, Nebraska, and more generally the Midwest states. So once again, that's probably this area in red on the map. Like it helped them. That was another factor in the mass migration to the West. Okay, there was mining and trying to get rich by finding gold or silver. There was also this cowboy system, this open range system. Now, how did it end? This open range system. The open range system is the cowboy system. It's called the open range system. Okay, there's one major date that you should remember concerning this is 1873. Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire. Okay, I put a picture right there. That's barbed wire. Now, why is it so important? The work of cowboys relied on an open range system. That means that cattle could go wherever they wanted. Now, with the invention of the barbed wire, cattle could be fenced. Cattle could be fenced, and that logically would mean the end of the open range system, the end of the cowboys. Another reason for the end of the open range was that more and more people were actually moving west, and it was problematic to have cattle roaming free in the plains. I mean, cattle going wherever they wanted. They had to be fenced because more and more people were buying land in the west. So once again, this era, the cowboys era, was important as people came to the west, and it helped the development of many states. But it was not actually sustainable when more and more people started to pour in. And finally, that's the last aspect we're going to talk about. So there was the mining, the mining front, the advance of the mining front, conflicts with between the Native Americans and the Americans. This cowboy era, that was one of the factors. And then I will have a look at the role of farmers in the West. Now, after the Civil War, farming was impossible in many places in the West. The soil was not fertile. It was not possible to farm in many places. And what happened is that the government actually gave money, well, put money into huge projects of irrigation. Okay, there were public funds for irrigation works. The idea was to improve the lands and make them fertile. I'm talking about irrigation right here. There were actually many inventions in the second half of the 19th century that would help in this process of fertilizing the land, of making them suitable for agriculture. Now, among the obstacles that farmers and their families were facing were natural elements. Okay, there was a battle with the elements. As in the West, there were tornadoes, droughts, prairie fires, blizzards. Okay, depending if you're in the north or the south. Okay, the climate is very different from if you compare Texas to Dakota, for example. But anyway, they were battling the elements, and it was another obstacle to the advance of this farming front, so to speak, to the west. But the government really wanted to encourage people move west, especially small farmers move west. That's what we're going to talk about in the next section. Land grants in the west. Now the U.S. government really wanted to encourage people and especially farmers to move west. And in the middle of the Civil War in 1862, they passed an act, the Homestead Act. That's another milestone in American history that's very famous, so you should remember this, the Homestead Act of 1862. And the Homestead Act actually offered free land for farmers in the West. Okay, there were two possibilities. Possibility number one, farmers would be given land for free if they lived on it for 5 years. So all you had to do was to move west, settle somewhere, live there for 5 years, and then the land was yours. Okay, you were literally given land for free after 5 years. Or possibility number two, they could buy land at a very inexpensive price after 6 months. So you could live on a piece of land for 6 months and then you could buy it very cheap, or you could live on it for 5 years and then it would be given, it would be free. Now, the idea behind this policy was to encourage small farmers to move west. Remember, that's 1862. That's in the middle of the Civil War. We still have this debate on slavery. And when I say they wanted to encourage small farmers to move west, really the U.S. government wanted to encourage small farmers who did not own slaves and who are small family farmers, that's not planters. Okay, they wanted to favor small farmers over planters, okay, big plantations with slaves. And the idea, once again, we are in the middle of the Civil War. The idea was that the U.S. wanted to avoid the reproduction of the plantation system in the West, meaning that the agricultural system of the South, based on big plantations and many slaves, they wanted to keep it in the South. Okay, they did not know yet if they were going to win the war or not, and more specifically, they didn't know if they were going to abolish slavery or not. So at least what they wanted was that the West would be settled by small farmers. And this system of big plantations and this system of mass slavery would, at the very least, remain in the South, but would not expand to become something that would spread on the whole continent. Okay? So we're still in this context in the middle of the Civil War. Now, as farmers move west, I mentioned that before, but the railroad system grew, and the number of miles of railroad tracks actually increased. I showed that in the previous slide. But the government actually gave land to railroad companies. And the railroad companies used the land to, and I think I wrote that. Yeah. The railroad companies used this land, so that's 200 million acres of land, to build small towns along the line. So as the railroad network grew, small towns were built for the farmers who were settling there, for the miners, for the former cowboys, all those who were actually moving west. So it was not all about building railroad tracks to connect the West Coast to the East Coast, but it was also about creating new small towns along the line where farmers were actually settling. Okay, so you get an idea of the picture. People moved to find gold or silver, then conflicts arose with the Native Americans, then cowboys came in, but more and more people were coming in, so they had to fence the cattle. That was the end of the open range, and small farmers also moved. That's how the West was conquered: mining, cowboys, and small farmers, with the importance of the railroad system that was connecting each small town, each new small town in this vast area. But then we come to the end of the frontier, the end of the wilderness. Okay, remember, for the Americans, since the very beginning of colonization, there was always this line, this imaginary line called the frontier. The frontier was a line that run north to south, and on the east was civilization, was the settlers, and on the west lived the Native Americans, the wilderness. And this line, this frontier, kept moving. Okay, at first it was just the east coast, and it moved a little bit further in the 18th century. Then when the United States declared their independence, this line moved all the way to the Mississippi River. And there, after the Civil War, with the conquest of the West through mining, the railroad, the cowboys, small farmers, this line moved west and west and west until the end of the frontier, meaning the Americans had settled the entire continent from coast to coast. That's what the end of the frontier means. That means the end of the New West. The whole continent was inhabited by Americans, okay, from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now in this section I'm going to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner, who had a very peculiar analysis of the end of the frontier, and that was very influential at the time and even today in American history. Now there was a census, a population count in 1890. Hang on, I think I wrote that. Yeah, there was a census in 1890. Okay, a population count. And after this 1890 census, this census showed that there was no longer a frontier. Once again, no longer a line beyond which the population density was significantly lower than in the rest of the country. And like I said, Frederick Jackson Turner developed his influential frontier thesis. Now his idea, Turner's idea, was that the American democracy had been shaped by the frontier. That this democracy, the American democracy, actually grew out of many influences, many European influences. And to him, the American frontier, this concept, the frontier, that represented liberty. Okay, it was always on the edge of a wild new land in between the wilderness and civilization. So it was a special society, and there was a special kind of culture along the frontier. Okay, right in between what was the wilderness, and in between what was the wilderness and civilization. Okay, it was a special culture, society that was more open, that was away from big towns, away from the corruption of urban life. I think I wrote that. Okay, so here's Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay, that's his idea. The frontier represented liberty, represented democracy, and it was away from the corruption of urban life. And I put a famous quote. Turner in 1893 concluded that the frontier has gone, and with its going has gone the first period of American history. Okay, as if the first period, meaning that the Americans now controlled the entire country from the East Coast to the West Coast. And once again, to him, the idea was that this first period of history began with the colonization, began with that's what you learn in the first semester, okay? Began with the first colonization of small colonies and controlling only some small parts on the East Coast, and then settling on the East Coast, and then moving west and west and west through the 17th, through the 19th, through the 18th, through the 19th century, all the way until this 1890 census, where finally the Americans were controlling the entire continent. So remember that. That's an interesting concept. Well, you'll probably learn about it next year and the year after. But remember it. There's this idea that history, well, American history is moving west. It's all about moving west, and that began in 1607 and finally ended in 1890. Okay, that's the idea behind this frontier thesis. Well, I make a long story short, but remember also that Turner, Frederick Jackson Turner, tended to ignore the role of women in this in this westward movement, the role of African Americans, the role of Native Americans, the role of Latinos, the role of Asians. But it was still quite influential at the time to say that that this was the end of the first period of American history. Now, what were the consequences of this closing of the frontier, of the end of the frontier? Now, one of the consequences was the emergence of the conservation movement. The conservation movement represents the first steps of ecology in the U.S. You should have a class about the conservation movement, I think, in your third year, or maybe that's a master's class. I can't quite remember, but that's something that you will definitely learn about in the next few years. The conservation movement, that's the beginning of ecology, so to speak, in America. And I give you one main date. That's 1872. In 1872, the first national park in the world was created. Okay, that's the first in America, but that's the first national park. The idea of national park did not quite exist before. And the first national park was created, and that's the Yellowstone National Park, okay, NP's National Park. And just for a little bit of history, there were debates in Congress to decide whether railroads would be allowed to run through the park. okay, if it would be allowed to build railroad tracks through Yellowstone. And the decision was that railroad inside the park would not be allowed, fortunately. So it was the first great victory of ecology, of the environment over civilization and economic progress, so to speak. When they decided that this area, this Yellowstone National Park, would be protected, and that nothing should be built. Well, railroad tracks should not be built in this area, in the Yellowstone National Park. So that's how it ended, this conquest of the New West. So that was the second half, basically, of the 19th century. So we talked about what happened after the Civil War, how the South was rebuilt, how slavery ended, but segregation began. That's in the South. We talked about the West, okay, conquering the West. One thing I did not mention was what happened in the North during this post-Civil War period. That's basically between the 1860s to the end of the 19th century. That's actually another chapter. I think you'll learn that next year. This chapter of what happened in the North in the 19th century is basically the mass industrialization of the North. And that's what's called the rise of big business. That's the rise of big factories, the rise of capitalism in the North, the first strikes, trade unions, the fight for an 8-hour work day. Okay, so all these things I didn't mention in this class. You'll definitely learn that later on. But remember that it happened at the same time as the South was struggling to be rebuilt, and the South was passing laws to segregate white and blacks. And at the same time, Native Americans were fighting the U.S. Army in the West, and the West was being conquered. So that's what you'll learn next year, hopefully. And then that's where my class ends. So if you want to have a look at this year, I think ending with this idea that it's the end of the first period of American history is pretty interesting. That's what you've been learning through this first year. Okay, since the very beginning, 1607, the first settlers arrived in Virginia to total control of the continent from the East Coast to the West Coast. So you'll see that next year, and do learn all the things I said for the exam that's coming. And I'm actually going to give you more details about the exam whenever I know. So keep watching what I put on YouTube, and check your Moodle spaces and check your emails. There'll definitely be more details to come.